there are mathematical aspects of semiotics, which are not that complicated. And once we have those in mind, we know that languages, symbols adapt themselves to cultures. They come out of cultures, and the grammars to support those symbols come out of cultures. So yes, I think that the right way to look at it, it's. I also asked this about the mind. Cognitive science, as generally understood, asks what is in the mind. To me, the question is not what is in the mind, but what culture is the mind in, or what is the mind in, just more generally. And that's a similar way of putting it relative to cognitive sciences. So it has, how have our minds adapted to our cultures, and how have our languages adapted to our minds and our cultures? I think that's the right way to look at it.
Welcome to The Story of Language, an original podcast series about language, linguistics, cognition, and culture. My name is Christian Saunders and I am an English teacher. And throughout this series, I will be in discussion with Dan Everett, linguist, anthropologist, philosopher, and author. In this episode, we talk about the cognitive revolution and whether the revolution really exists at all. We discuss the beginnings and the state of the art of the study of cognition and show why it's important to celebrate all discoveries as progress, even if they are doomed to failure. If you would like to contact us, you can find us on Twitter at storyoflanguage.com, or you can send us an email at storyoflanguage@gmail.com. This is episode 10 of The Story of Language. Today we are going to talk about the cognitive revolution. And you know, when I was researching about this subject, the thing that I found most interesting was how the history of language learning, which is my interest, how that kind of mirrors the progress of like the understanding of linguistics. Like for example, you know, there was a time when psychology was focused on behaviorism, and so was language learning. You know, they were kind of paralleled. And I'm, you know, and then, for example, if we look at the ancient past, you know, learning language was done using, you know, like grammar translation method. And in today's modern world, it's more of a usage-based kind of language learning approach. My question to start with is, are we really learning more about how language works, or are we just kind of following culture?
Well, it really depends on how you understand progress, obviously, in understanding language. You know, if we take the broad sweep of history and language going back to the ancient Greeks and Indian scholars, there has definitely been progress, although some of the ideas that are really popular today, such as topic and comment and generative procedures and these sorts of things, are fairly ancient. So is the concept of signs. If we look at the specific work of Chomsky and his followers, of which there are thousands, we see a really interesting development that did happen back in the 50s when Chomsky proposed a particular view of grammar, which seemed to people to be very impressive because for at least three reasons. One was empirical. He was able to notice. I mean, he didn't just explain things. He noticed things that people hadn't really noticed in linguistics. So the famous case of auxiliary movement, or in English, when you ask a question. So John is here. Is John here? John bought the book. Did John buy the book? These sorts of things people noticed, obviously, because they speak English, but Chomsky was the first one to notice the theoretical interest, or he was certainly one of the first. And And he developed an interesting, and for many people, including myself at the time, a very convincing, I mean, I wasn't around reading linguistics in 1957. I was 6 years old. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm that old, but I'm getting there. But it was, these were good ideas. They were very convincing. They were presented in an extremely technical, scientific vocabulary and style that just hadn't been seen in linguistics, a lot of whose writers have been fairly discursive and who really didn't have a theory of linguistics in the sense that we often think of what a theory is, a formal model. And instead they vacillated back and forth between talking about language learning and describing structures of new languages and coming up with statements on how to generalize across those things. And there were some linguists just as sophisticated in mathematics as Chomsky ever was, maybe even more so, such as Charles Hockett and in some ways even Leonard Bloomfield. But Chomsky just hit it just right. He had brilliant ideas, so empirically, theoretically, and then he changed. His huge change was to move us towards what he called rationalism, which he associated with the concept of innate ideas, which certainly also was not unique to him, but which had been pretty much discarded by the time he came along, and he revived it in some sense. You have to be careful when you talk about these things because the world is a large place and there's a lot of smart people in it and they're all working. So, it's like, asking when did studies of cognition begin, when did studies of the mind begin, is like asking when the first human emerged. There wasn't a day when, it's not like at one time Australopithecus went to bed and the next day woke up as a man or a woman. There is no such thing as a first man or first woman. There are all sorts of gradual experiments in between Australopithecus and humans, and we have a very spotty fossil record, and there's a lot of stuff we don't know. But we know that it doesn't make any sense to talk about Adam and Eve. Unless you actually believe that God created the world, there was no first man or first woman. There is a time when you can point to a man and point to a woman, and times before that when you can't. But then there's a huge space of hundreds of thousands of years probably in between, in which we have creatures approaching humanness, but who weren't quite fully human as we would define it today. So the same thing with studies of cognition. So language has, I think, grown. We have improved our understanding of language. Chomsky's been a part of that. He's, for some people, he's been the major catalyst, and for other people, he's just one voice. And, I think we have instincts and the idea that we have inborn knowledge. These are very important ideas. They've been around human history ever since we started thinking about it. And Chomsky tapped into that. I don't find it particularly interesting. There are interesting ways to talk about innate knowledge, and there's nobody who doesn't believe in innate knowledge. I mean innate mental capacities. I wouldn't call it knowledge, but innate capacities. And so the question is, how developed are those things, and whose theory makes the most sense given the evidence? And I just don't think that nativism, Chomsky's primary claim to fame, in his perspective, where we actually have specific hardwired abilities. It's not clear though. I mean, so if we just go back to some of the major things that Chomsky proposed, auxiliary inversion, which was the big focus of syntactic structures. That's interesting. It was very interesting at the time, but it doesn't exist like that anymore. There are similar operations, but it's that operation in particular is not found anymore. So we can't consider that, a discovery. It's a milestone perhaps along the way to other things, but there's not a single thing that stands. Deep structure, for example, was considered to be a huge breakthrough. So we start off with this kind of underlying sentence in the deep structure, and we apply operations to it, and we get what we actually say. The surface structure, which is then interpreted by our sound structure, the phonology, which then, that was very interesting stuff, but that's not that doesn't hold up anymore. I mean, Chomsky abandoned that over 20 years ago, probably 25, 30 years ago now. So there's no deep structure, there's no surface structure. All these things are changing, and that in itself, of course, is not bad. Good science is always evolving. So the basic way that, if you want to consider it progress, that the theoretical Chomskyan understanding of language has made progress is the formal tools have changed. So if you think that the ones that exist today are better than the ones that existed 10 years ago, then there's been progress. But those aren't going to be around very long either, because these things change all the time, because they're not discoveries. They're not empirical discoveries. They're simply postulates on this is the best way to look at language right now that we know of for people in that particular theoretical framework. So, if somebody would ask me what are the major discoveries of generative linguistics, well, I can't think of any. I can't think of a single one. Anything we know about language today in a general sense that we didn't know about it 50, 60 years ago, except for what has been neglected in Peircean studies and semiotics. But we knew about that, but given Peirce's particular history, it didn't. Even though there are hundreds of books out now and more people working on it, and it's extremely sophisticated and very formal, it still isn't mainstream.
But I'm wondering, like for example, if you read a lot of the literature about the cognitive revolution, they always put the date around the the 50s, and some of them even put the specific date when there was that conference at MIT. But this a lot of the debate, especially revolving around Chomsky about innateness or not innateness. I mean, isn't that just a repeat of the whole rationalist versus empiricist debate that that Plato was having thousands of years ago?
Yeah, it's the debate between rationalism and empiricism has been going on for a long time. What Chomsky did was supposedly to revive it. So September 11th, which is a bad day, September 11th, 2001, but September 11th, 1956, was the day that MIT held a conference, and the speakers included, they had originally invited Chomsky's teacher, Zelig Harris, but Zelig Harris didn't go for one reason or another, and he suggested Chomsky, so they invited Chomsky. And so it was Chomsky and George Miller, Alan Newell, and Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon went on to win a Nobel Prize in economics, and he and Alan Newell are among the founders of artificial intelligence. One could argue that just a couple of years later, with the appearance of his book Speech Acts, John Searle was an early cognitive scientist. So these people, what happened was they were all talking about what goes on in the mind. The artificial intelligence people wanted to get computers who could think like humans, and they thought they were making progress. Chomsky wanted to understand not the actual words that come out of people's mouths so much as the internal grammar that allowed those words to emerge, that generated those words. And when he said generate, he didn't mean create. He meant assign a very explicit structure to. And then George Miller was doing this fabulous work on short-term memory, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. All of these were brilliant insights. Chomsky had more influence than all the others because everybody's fascinated by language, but not everybody's a linguist. So when an actual linguist stands up and tells you how language works and they say it in terms that you understand, it's not a coincidence that this was the time. Chomsky presented a theory of human language as a computational system at a time when computers were really coming of age, and you had all these people. Chomsky was hired. So he worked with Zelig Harris, and he did his master's thesis, which was the morphophonemics of modern Hebrew, which had already some underlying forms in it. And then he went off, still a student of Harris at the University of Pennsylvania, but he got a very prestigious 4-year fellowship as a Harvard junior fellow, which B.F. Skinner had been a Harvard Junior Fellow, and this is about as high as you could get in academics for doctoral support. And he spent his time reading math and computer science, and came up with his thesis on transformational generative grammar, which was a brilliant idea. So here people thought, here's a linguist, and for the first time, he's not talking about these weird little languages out in the jungle that none of us really care about. He's actually saying, what is the mind got to be like for there to be language, and what are the formal properties of the mind? And his work was in some ways far more interesting than Claude Shannon's work on information theory, because Chomsky showed that he's claimed to have shown that Shannon's theory couldn't ultimately handle human language. He brought in mathematics of the kind that computer scientists really like, Emil Post and all sorts of other folks work on mathematics. So it was extremely timely, very brilliantly done, and became very influential. I mean, to me, the more important date is not September 11, 1956, but September 9th, 1956, because that was Elvis Presley's first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. If we talk about culturally, that's a far more important date to me than September 11th. But that's my own personal bias.
No, I think that's fair enough. And I'm sure that long-term history will look back on Elvis as a far more important figure than anyone from the field of linguistics.
I think that's the case. I mean, linguist Tom Givon, who's a very innovative linguist, who's always throughout his career been sort of wondering why anybody cared about Chomsky, when asked at a talk several years ago that I was at what he thought of Chomsky's recent ideas, he said, well, it's one more trip around the maypole. So as far as he's concerned, we've got about 70 years of going around the maypole.
Well, that's basically my next kind of question, which is, can theorizing about like innate structures and things like that, can they ever actually develop testable theories? For example, there's the famous rule-following paradox, developed by kind of Wittgenstein and Kripke, and they say no course of action could be determined by a rule because every course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. So, is it just a case that it's just a dead end because it can never produce testable theories?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to test. If you say that, see, Chomsky's theory of grammar works at two different levels. All the people who work in Chomsky's theory, well, not all of the people who work in Chomsky-like theories believe in universal grammar. So, for example, Paul Postal, who's a good friend of mine and who worked with Chomsky for many years, develops ideas on linguistic analysis that are compatible with Chomsky's ideas, except that Postal doesn't believe in universal grammar at all. He thinks the whole idea is incoherent. He believes that language is a sort of Platonic mathematical system that could never have evolved. We just discovered it because it exists, just like you could never have a system of mathematics in which 2 + 2 = 5. So according to Postal, that's the way, sort of like the way language is. You could never have a language in which, properties are very different from what we know about languages today, because language is this mathematical system. And he was heavily influenced by the late philosopher Jerry Katz in these ideas. So that's another view. I would say that 99% of the people who would call themselves Chomskyan linguists do very interesting empirical linguistic work in which universal grammar is not causally implicated at all. In other words, if I give you an analysis of the passive structure in some language, I'm not thinking of universal grammar so much. I'm thinking of what the theory has said about passive structures and how to translate those into this particular language. I would like to think that the theory is anchored in universal grammar, but me as a poor working syntactician, I really don't have what it takes to evaluate universal grammar. That's one fact. So the average working syntactician or phonologist doesn't really find universal grammar their papers, in their papers, universal grammar doesn't seem to be causally implicated. On the other hand, the appeal of universal grammar and that kind of thing is that I'm not simply, when I analyze this sentence and this weird little language that I've worked on, or this big language I've worked on. I mean, all languages are significant. I wouldn't want that to be taken the wrong way. But so I've discovered a structure, but I can now attribute more importance to my work because this structure I have discovered must therefore be part of universal grammar. And that gives so much more importance to what I'm doing than merely describing languages. That's the view. That's what supposedly sets Chomsky and linguistics apart from all the linguistics that preceded it. So my first teacher was Kenneth Pike, who did not believe in universal grammar, but he also was the first. He wrote about a lot of things that are important to Chomsky before Chomsky did. He just didn't believe in universal grammar. He believed that we had to describe languages. He thought he would have probably said we're too far away from understanding the languages that are currently spoken in the world to yet have this kind of deductive theory. That's the other thing. There are three forms of reasoning, and basically only three forms, and nobody can reason except with one of those three forms, and those are deduction, which is going from a premise to conclusions, and it's always certain. If you have the right premise and you're following standard deductive procedures, you get to the right conclusion. That's largely how math works. And the other one is induction, which means you start with facts, and you say that other facts being like these facts, the generalization is probably X. So you're reasoning. So deduction is reasoning from generals to particulars, and induction is reasoning from particulars to generals. Induction is far more probabilistic, and it's never certain. Deduction is certain, induction is uncertain. And then abduction, which is just the formalization of guessing, which was introduced into logic by Charles Peirce, is the idea that, here's a fact that I don't have an account for. This fact surprises me. Like, let's say I see a tree and the leaves are red, and I expected them to be green. Well, that's a surprising fact that the leaves are red. But then I can say, well, in fall, leaves die, and the red is a byproduct of the changing seasons. Therefore, I have evidence that changing seasons cause red because they remove my surprise. I could easily say it's red because somebody painted them. And so I've generated two hypotheses. One, they're red because they were painted, and two, they're red because the seasons are changing. And now I go back to induction and deduction to choose between those different hypotheses. So Chomsky was the first, in the eyes of many linguists, to put linguistic theory out there as a deductive theory. He gave a set of principles that were supposed to be universal, and they were universal because they were innate, and from those you could deduce the structures expected to be found in the world's languages. That's a very powerful idea. It was extremely attractive to many people, and there are thousands of careers built on that. And so if that turns out to be wrong, then those careers were misplaced.
One of the reasons that's been suggested for the cognitive revolution is because it was felt like just describing and kind of cataloging languages wasn't enough, and that the field needed, they wanted theoretical insights. And it's kind of similar to a criticism that I receive in my work as a language teacher, because I'm a big believer in a descriptive point of view of language, and there's a lot of people who, again, they're interested in language but they're not linguists, who feel like that it's not enough to just let people use language to communicate, that they have to use it in specific ways. And I kind of feel like that maybe that psychology is mirrored in this idea of needing to have kind of rules that explain how language work. And is it not? Do we really need to have this idea of a kind of universal grammar or universal structures? Is it not just enough to simply observe and describe language?
There are a couple of levels of answer that can be given to that question. The theories are very important to us because we don't like doubt and confusion. I mean, one of the most important philosophers to work on this was Immanuel Kant, who talked about the need to reduce um, the manifold of experience to generality. We experience all these things around us, and we would like to make it simpler. We would like to know, so we categorize the world around us. There's scientific taxonomy. You put dinosaurs in one phylum, and you put Homo sapiens in one species and Homo erectus in another species, and Homo is one genus, and you put that into a larger family, you put that into a phylum. We like, organization is very important. It brings sense to the world, and that's what theories do. But notice that taxonomy is always a part of theory. You can't really get a good theory of where things came from unless you do taxonomy first. So if you're describing a language and you say, okay, here's the grammar of X. Well, who cares? You haven't told me how this fits into our larger knowledge. And so, some of Chomsky's followers called that kind of linguistics taxonomic linguistics, butterfly collecting. Oh, look, mommy, I found a pretty grammar out here. But, what's the big deal? Who cares? Well, first of all, taxonomic linguistics has to precede theoretical linguistics, or at least go hand in hand with it. So in addition to needing theories to bring order to our world, we need theories to give significance to our work. So if I'm describing a grammar and my work doesn't fit into a particular theory, most people aren't going to pay much attention to the grammar that I wrote. But if I can say, so there's this, there were a lot of grammars written before Chomsky came along, but the one grammar that Chomsky used to hold up as the number one grammar ever written, he said it's worth 1,000 other grammars, was a grammar of Hidatsa, Siouan language. Hidatsa syntax was the name of the grammar. And it was written by, he's deceased now, Hugh Matthews, who turned out to be a good friend of mine. I mean, many years later, he and I met and we became really great friends. He was one of the ones who was hired at MIT along with Chomsky. He was hired about the same time as Chomsky, and he was a professor at MIT until he eventually left and became a missionary, where it's sort of a weird story. But Hugh Matthews wrote this grammar of Hidatsa syntax by simply giving rules and showing how they fit into larger principles of Chomsky's theory. He didn't give much data. You really couldn't pick up that book and find out much about Hidatsa syntax, but you could find out about the rules that he said that it illustrated. And Chomsky liked it because it showed that it wasn't just some unique collection of sentences and discourses, but that it actually fit into Chomsky's theory. So Chomsky said it was worth more than 1,000 other grammars in a 1972 publication. And, even Hugh Matthews repudiated that grammar later because it just didn't have much data. But so we want to give prominence to what we do. These theories become very big social organizations as well. So it's not just meaning intellectually, but meaning socially. If you choose to work within Chomsky's theory, you're working in the most powerful and widespread framework around. And if you choose not to work in it, well, then for a lot of people, you're outside of linguistics. You don't have the same kinds of allies. You don't have the same network. So it's a real security blanket to master the basic components of a theory, to work within that theory. When I started, it's a personal story, it doesn't mean that much. When I started working in Chomsky's theory, we got to be very good friends, and he would send me all of his publications this was before the internet. So I would be in Brazil, and I would get this package of unpublished papers that were brand new by Noam Chomsky. And it was quite the prestigious thing for me to be able to show my colleagues at the University of Compiègne, oh, look, Chomsky sent me a package of papers, and this was a big deal. And I went to MIT and spent a year there as a visiting scholar, and Chomsky would come into my office and I would go in his office, and we talked a lot. And when it's time to apply for jobs, he helped me. He wrote strong letters of recommendation for my first job and my promotion case. But then when I left the theory, he said I'm a charlatan and not to be taken seriously. So there was a huge transformation, and that's going to happen to people when they drop out of theories to go on their own way.
I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? And that's something I wanted to ask you about, because I think that probably a majority of linguists working today, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but you'll probably find them in the psychology department of most universities. And I'm wondering if you feel like that's the right place for them to be. If you feel like that, that basically linguistics is a kind of subfield of psychology.
Well, I think you find one of Chomsky's contributions was that many linguistics departments started after his work, and he was influential in getting linguistics as a discipline to become so powerful in the United States. The early grants from the US military, because they were interested in machine translation, and because Chomsky had been hired at MIT by Victor Ingve, who was one of the pioneers of computational linguistics and machine translation in the world, people thought that Chomsky's theory was going to be very important for machine translation. In particular, the U.S. military thought this, Department of Defense. So a lot of Department of Defense grants and a lot of U.S. Army and Navy Air Force grants went to help start departments and fund the research of Chomskyan linguists. But, machine translation was developed later, much more accurately, by people who don't really pay that much attention to Chomsky's theories. There's now a big Center for Machine Translation at Carnegie Mellon University that I used to have some contact with when I was professor of computational linguistics at Pitt and CMU. So Chomsky would say that linguistics is a branch of biology and that psychology is too. On the other hand, Edward Sapir would have said that psychology and linguistics are both branches of anthropology. And that so, this kind of labeling, Peirce would have said that anthropology and linguistics, psychology and biology are all, in a sense, branches of semiotics. So you get different ways of looking at these things, and it's not clear what's gained by arguing at length about these things. Chomsky's theory is still the most powerful theory in social terms, but it isn't probably the biggest theory anymore. In fact, I would say that its numbers are falling in many parts of the world, and that's neither here nor there. There are lots of other ways of looking at language. I think newer generations of linguists who are much more mathematically and experimentally oriented, such as my son, or who, at the University of Miami, or people who work in MIT's Brain and Cognitive Sciences Department, or the Department of Psychology at Berkeley, and many other places. These more quantitative oriented folks tend not to work so much in Chomsky's theory. There are exceptions, obviously, but there are always exceptions. So anything I say about people do this, people do that, these are full of exceptions. There's, people are complex, and so you find them spread out across a lot of different areas. So, there's also a theory out right now, the model theoretic syntax, which is very important. It's not, it's been around for a while, and one of the primary proponents of model theoretic syntax is Geoffrey Pullum, who's at the University of Edinburgh. And it's extremely formal, but it's not concerned about universal grammar. So a lot of people stay away from it because there's no strong cognitive claim. They use formal devices to come up with formal characteristics and characterizations of human languages, and they don't speculate on the ultimate sources of these devices. So that's less exciting to some people, because it doesn't say, oh, look, I found a structure, and this structure comes from our genes, which is to most biologists is a very implausible notion.
I'm really interested in asking you a couple more questions about how Chomsky's been so influential, and how his work kind of reflects maybe power structures in linguistic study. And for example, George Miller recently published like a reflection of his role in the cognitive revolution. And he said in his paper that he wrote, he said, the behavioral revolution transformed experimental psychology in the US. Perception became discrimination, memory became learning, language became verbal behavior, and intelligence became what intelligence tests test. And when I read that, it really hit me hard because, like, I spend a lot of my time telling students that these language exams that they do, which supposedly measure their fluency, are often a terrible reflection of their actual language ability. And so maybe, by focusing on the results of one particular discipline, maybe the linguistics has been kind of led astray.
Well, it's a dramatic simplification of the historical record to talk about behaviorism in that particular way. Behaviorism was a revolution, but before that revolution, there was still cognitivism. I mean, Immanuel Kant, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Charles Sanders Peirce, many people worked on cognition long before behaviorist so-called revolution. And when behaviorism did come around, there are a couple of different versions of it, many versions of it, in fact. One version is fairly innocuous. It says that to understand the mind, we have to see how what the behavior tells us about the mind. I mean, that's the way all school exams work, I mean, it may be that language exams could be better designed. When I had to take some language exams, they brought in a native speaker and just told me to talk to that person. And then they evaluated how well I could talk to him by whether I was talking to him or not. That wasn't so bad. Written tests about oral abilities is like testing the wrong thing. But, math tests, you can tell the teacher, look, I knew the answer to this math question. I can do this math. And she might say, well, you never passed the exams. I don't know how I'm supposed to believe you can do it when you never pass the exam. So there is a definite belief that behavior indicates the mind. It's part of pedagogy. It's part of even science. I mean, Chomsky and linguists have to evaluate behavior, that is what people say and then what they say about what they think they said and what they meant. These are all behaviors, and they use these to get at what the mind must be. But behaviorism took a different turn when Burrhus F. Skinner came along, B.F. Skinner, and proposed verbal behavior. Skinner really didn't know much about language. He just was on a roll. He was, he denied he had a simple theory: deny the brain, deny the mind, and just talk about behavior, since we can measure that. And he showed that, you can measure behavior fairly accurately. And then why propose the mind? It's just behavior. Well, so he came out with this book, Verbal Behavior, which is not entirely stupid. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there. But Chomsky wrote a review of that book, which in retrospect we can pick apart. I mean, a lot of behaviorists felt like that review that Chomsky wrote didn't understand behaviorism. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that the effect of that review was to destroy behaviorism. In 1959, when that review came out, people thought, well, how did we ever believe this silly stuff about verbal behavior? And that was the end of it. I read a biography of B.F. Skinner that said he had nightmares of Chomsky for years. I don't know if I have no idea whether that's true or not. Since we're talking about a behaviorist, he would have to give a behavior that showed nightmares. I don't know, but that was a devastating review, whatever we think about its content, and it changed. So So it wasn't a cognitive revolution. It was a cognitive resurgence, a cognitive victory, not over behaviorism, because there's still an American Behavioral Association and thousands of people who still do behaviorism. So it never went away. Just a few years ago, I gave the annual B.F. Skinner lecture to this society. I know that B.F. Skinner's name is still held and, still revered, but he introduced a radical behaviorism. His form of behaviorism was much more out there than other forms of behaviorism. And John Stadden has a great book called The New Behaviorism, which outlines a very reasonable theory of behaviorism that is not subject to the criticisms that Chomsky leveled against Skinner's radical behaviorism, which other behaviorists call radical. So what happened was everybody was studying the mind, everybody was studying culture, everybody was studying the mental cognition, using the term cognition. And then behaviorism came along and said, look at this is really, really cool, and we can give much more formal theories. Although the first mathematical experimental psychology done in the United States was, again, in 1860, 1860s, early 70s, paper by Joseph Jastrow and Charles Sanders Peirce on measuring sensations. This was the first experimental psychology paper ever done in the United States, and second or third ever done in the world after the German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt. Psychology was around for a long time, and then Skinner changed its form. And then the so-called cognitive revolution brought us back to cognition. I mean, it didn't take us to cognition for the first time. It brought us back to cognition. So I might call it the cognitive counter-revolution or the cognitive resurgence, but it was not a revolution in any sense of that word. One thing that happened to linguistics after that is whereas people like Sapir considered language as part of culture and society, Chomsky succeeded in reifying linguistics. There was an enormous reification of linguistics, and I have a paper on that. Actually, there was a conference at the British Academy several years ago on the 60th anniversary of the cognitive revolution, and they invited a number of people who were very pro-Chomskyan, but apparently the funders told them it couldn't be just a big happy party for the believers, so they had to, so they wound up inviting me. So my talk was why there was no cognitive revolution.
Just to stick the knife in and twist the knife.
Yeah, and why there are no innate ideas. I know all these people. I've known them for a long time. The people who work in these areas, I don't know all of them, but I know a lot of them prominent names, and they're good people. They're really smart people. Somebody said, if you don't believe in universal grammar, how do you account for all the discoveries in linguistics? Well, my first response was to ask what discoveries, but I decided not to be rude and say, if for 60 years you've got a lot of really smart people working on language, they're going to come up with good ideas. It doesn't matter what theory they're working on, right? I mean, you're just simply telling me that there's 60 years of really smart people working on language, and they've discovered a couple of things, although the only way we know their discoveries is if they can also be stated outside of Chomsky's theory, because there are a lot of theories of language. And so what is a discovery? Is it something that just one theory can appreciate, or is it something that, I don't know, you don't see these kinds of things. The closest thing you have to it in, say, physics is string theory, which is considered by a lot of people to be really out there, bizarre stuff. I'm not a physicist, so I don't know. There was a lot of good work that came out. George Miller's work was spectacular. Alan Newell and Herb Simon, as I think back on it, Alan Newell, Herb Simon, they were at Carnegie Mellon, and I got to know both of them when I was at Carnegie Mellon on the computational linguistics faculty when I was at the University of Pittsburgh. And Chomsky I've known for over 40 years. John Searle, who was part of it a couple of years later throughout, has been a friend of mine for over 40 years. I didn't meet George Miller, but I've been around these ideas. So take Alan Newell and Herb Simon. They tried, they were pioneers in artificial intelligence, which is extremely important. And, anytime you think about talking to a machine, that's artificial intelligence and it's computational linguistics. So these are very important practical fields of technology. But I don't think that in Dark Matter of the Mind, my Chicago Press book, I talk about what I consider to be major flaws in the conceptualization of artificial intelligence. But these are still progress, right? These are all interesting ideas. I don't really think computers think. They don't think like humans think. They can solve problems. They can do all kinds of interesting stuff. But, I think the reason it's called artificial intelligence is because it is artificial and it's not real intelligence. And I don't think that language, there is a universal grammar. And, George Miller's work is brilliant on short-term memory. There's nothing to say. I mean, and all this work is brilliant. The fact that it didn't pan out doesn't mean it wasn't brilliant. Most of our ideas don't pan out. We're just a young species in the history of the world, and we've only had toilet paper for a couple of hundred. I don't know how long we've had it, but as one thing George Miller showed was that it's very hard for humans to remember more than 7 things in their working memory. And so after a couple of million years of evolution, we can only remember 7 things. It's nothing to get too excited about. We're not these great cognitive monsters that rule the universe. I bet there's a species that can remember more than 7 things. To get excited about the idea that we've discovered the true theory of anything is pretty silly. We just make progress, and it gives us great satisfaction in our lives, and we know we've developed a way of evaluating these things, and it seems to be valid. Peirce said that we all make mistakes, and mistakes are built into science and built into reasoning. This is called fallibilism. But as a society working together over a long period of time, at some distant point in the future, when we reach the end of inquiry about a specific problem, we can say we've achieved truth. When will that end of inquiry come for anything? We don't know. In the meantime, we push forward with hope and satisfaction. I mean, I love what I do. Somebody asked me once, "Are you sure you're right about Pinahan?" My answer is, hell no, I don't know that I'm right. I mean, I've done the best I can. It might be that I'm wrong, but I don't think it's going to be that easy to show. And certainly people have been trying to show it for the past couple of decades, but nobody has a monopoly on the truth. I am just another humble soul out there trying to figure out things that are really complicated and much more complicated than my brain.
I love that way of thinking, and I don't work in academia. I'm not an academic, but I've definitely seen perhaps a lack of that kind of attitude, people willing to accept that they could be wrong and that they're just part of a longer chain of humanity just trying to understand more about the world.
Yeah, I mean, you get the attitude from some people working in linguistics and other sciences that they really should be wearing robes and there should be incense burning about them as they work and approach the truth. And, that's just not the way. It's just not the way it is. And I'm not making light of it. I mean, science is really hard work. It takes huge rigor. And, you watch the tapes on reasoning and thinking and scientific research by Richard Feynman, one of the most brilliant physicists who ever lived. And he just talks about how hard the work is. And it's really hard in every discipline. Even though, let's say physicists are the smartest scientists, and linguists are the dumbest scientists. Well, I'm one of the dumb of the dumb. But it doesn't make it any less difficult. My problems are hard for me, and I work on them all day. From the time I get up in the morning till the time I go to bed at night, I'm reading and writing and trying to figure things out, except for when I make tacos and stuff. But
with Tabasco sauce.
Well, I make my own salsa, but I grew up on the border with Mexico, so I have strong opinions about Mexican food. We're doing the best we can, and some of us are privileged enough to be paid to do this stuff. And so we have to return an honest day's labor for an honest day's pay. I mean, I come from a blue collar. I came from poverty, growing up in a trailer park, and so I feel so privileged to be doing what I'm doing now, when I could, if I had followed in the footsteps of my 2 fathers, my stepfather and my biological father, I would be dead now of either alcoholism or working myself to death 3 jobs like my stepfather did. But actually, I have a really good job, and I get to pursue these things. And I have the internet, which is the most marvelous invention for scholars since the book. The book is still a much better invention. There's no technology better than the book. So anyway, we're all working on this together, and we shouldn't take it too seriously, although people do take themselves very seriously, because if you say, hey, look, I don't think there's any universal grammar, then people say, then what have I been doing for the past 50 years? And I say, I don't know, really. People attach a lot of self-worth into these things.
Obviously, there's, like what we were talking about before, that there are some ideas that are still very powerful in the world of linguistics. And so one of those is innateness. And there's this great quote from Hilary Putnam, and he said, "Let a complete 17th century education be innate if you like. Invoking innateness only postpones the problem of learning. It does not solve it." How do you feel about that?
Well, Hilary Putnam has a very interesting history. He just died last year or the year before. He's one of my favorite philosophers of all time. He went to high school with Chomsky, and he and Chomsky went to high school and college together, and they had known each other forever. And Putnam deeply respected Chomsky, and I think Chomsky deeply respected Putnam. But, I totally agree with that statement, saying that, let's say you want to claim that relative clauses are the way they are because they're innate. Well, how did they get to be innate? What were the conditions that led to their evolution? What was, that's one thing when people propose that something's part of universal grammar, they give no evolutionary history of it at all. And you can't say something is innate with any meaning without trying to come up with an account of how it evolved. Yet somebody has to be talking about how it evolved. I mean, you could say, well, I'm just an anatomist. I just find these things out, and I know they're part of the body, and I know the body evolved, but I'm not an evolutionary biologist. Okay, fair enough. But where is the evolutionary linguists that show us where these things got into universal grammar? Pinker tried to do some of this, but it wasn't successful. I mean, I could go into a long discussion of why it wasn't successful, but Pinker is one who's tried with his former student Paul Bloom, but I don't find these approaches passing muster. So, Dan Slobin, a psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, said that poverty of stimulus is just poverty of imagination. You say that there's not enough evidence. Well, it's because you probably framed the problem wrongly. What you find, a standard argumentative or argumentation method in generative grammar is to reify the subject, to make it so specialized that you can't see how it's connected to anyone else or anything else, and say, so where did that come from? Well, nobody has an answer to that, because the way you stated it just. So if you go back to 1976 and you look at these famous debates between Jean Piaget and Noam Chomsky, Piaget was trying to find common ground because he believed in an innate order of acquisition of different things. And Chomsky wasn't having any of it. So Chomsky would stand up to the board and look at WH movement, which of course Piaget didn't know anything about, and say, how could you handle that? Well, Piaget doesn't know how to handle that, because that's a very technical, theoretical component of Chomsky's theory, which most linguists, I think, don't even buy. It's a way of thinking about it that takes it away from meaning, that simply looks at a formal structure that the theory has proposed, and it's a sort of rhetorical trick, instead of putting it in terms where other people can understand it and interact with it. So a standard device to argue for innateness is to reify the subject matter to the point that it doesn't seem to have anything to do with other aspects of human cognition. But other people can come along and show that, in fact, there's a different perspective on it. And so to give one example, I used to teach Chomsky's theory regularly. For over 20 years in college, I taught Chomsky's theory when I taught linguistics. And then one year I came along upon the work of Robert Van Valen and his Roland reference grammar. And I read this enormous book that he had out, he and Randy Lapola, on Introduction to Roland reference grammar. And I thought, even though this is a big book, it's because it goes through so many case studies. It's actually simple. It's far simpler than Chomsky's theory, but I can't think of anything it leaves out. It accounts for all of it as pretty much natural semantic communicative responses, to the world. And so I stopped teaching Chomsky's theory and I started teaching Roland reference grammar. And this was long before I started taking people on about recursion. I just found that role and reference grammar was a simpler way of accounting for the same facts. And I realized that you didn't need to reify your explanations so much, and that these simpler explanations could work.
But I mean, if I'm going to play devil's advocate, I would say that innateness is in one way proven by the fact that, well, it's what Charles Hockett kind of argued, that really, the brain contains physical structures, synaptic connections, and they would, in a physical way, reflect, what the brain knows. So isn't that just a kind of innateness?
The human brain is innate. I mean, only humans have brains, and that's given by human genes, and the human brain makes human language possible. In that general sense, human language is definitely innate. There's no question about it. There's also the fact that, the brain is designed to establish and synaptic connections, and to get rid of other synaptic connections, to use it or lose it. And so, Evelina Fedorenko's work has shown that there are language networks that go across subjects and across languages, in which meaning structures, and she shows that syntax is secondary and that symbolic meaning is primary in these language networks, are basically semiotic networks. I'm trying to get her to call them that, but I doubt that she will. Anyway, so let me call them, her language networks I would call semiotic networks, and they're found in the brain. And they're found in pretty much the same place in everybody's brain. Does that mean it's innate? Well, she doesn't think so. She's agnostic on that. She doesn't think there's evidence to prove one way or the other, although she leans towards not innate. I tend to be less agnostic and more atheist. I don't think they are innate, but you say, well, how did they get where they're stored? Well, I don't know. One study I've suggested that nobody's ever taken me up on is where is the knowledge of burrito making in my brain, and where is the knowledge of burrito making in my Mexican friend's brain? And are they more or less in the same place? And are we therefore going to say that burrito making is innate? Well, the ability to make burritos is innate, and it involves certain kinds of conceptual and physical activities which might fit particular cells of the brain better than other cells of the brain, which means it would probably localize in the same place. Yeah, everything we know is in our brain. That doesn't mean everything we know is innate. It just means that the brain is itself innate and enables us to do this. So the question is never between nature and nurture. The question is how much nature and how much nurture. They're definitely, Chomsky says that universal grammar is just whatever the biology that supports language is, okay? Well, that's not a very good answer, because I can answer that the only biological specialization in the human body we know of for language is the position of the tongue. So maybe the tongue is therefore universal grammar. I don't think that's what he meant. We could say that the brain is universal grammar because that's the bio, but I also don't think that's what he meant. He means, even in spite of how he says it, he means that universal grammar is the biological component of language that is dedicated and innate to language only. And that we don't have any evidence for. There's just no evidence that such a thing exists. But there is a lot of evidence that the brain enables human language. But in my own work, I argue that other animals have things very close to linguistic systems, and I wouldn't want to say that only humans have language. Only humans. So communication, all creatures have. Just about every living creature. In fact, Peirce might even say that even rocks have an ability to communicate with their environment in some way. But language is specific to humans, and I've tried to give an account for why language is specific to humans. It is related to the human brain, but there's nothing specific for language in the human brain, and that's the big difference. There's a lot of stuff in the brain that makes language possible, but there's nothing in the brain that seems to be dedicated exclusively to language. Until after we've learned language. And then those things that Evelina Fedorenko has studied, those language or semiotic networks, they're pretty rigid. And once they're damaged in adults, you get very specific linguistic disorders. And so but these don't require innateness for their explanation.
Another very persistent idea from the cognitive revolution is, of course, the idea of universals, looking for linguistic universals. And I remember at the end of one of your talks recently, someone asked you about something about grammaticality versus ungrammaticality, and your reply was that you don't like those terms and that you prefer to talk about things that are acceptable and unacceptable. And I thought, well, yeah, because, especially for me who tries to teach language, something, and this is what I find attractive about other, theories of grammar, like, for example, construction grammar, is that they allow for just creativity. And I'm wondering if the search for rules is just almost completely pointless, like if it could just never happen.
Yeah, I think that the idea of acceptability and unacceptability versus grammaticality and ungrammaticality, this goes back to the generative semanticists and to people like George Lakoff, who argued for this position back in the 70s, the early 70s. And I think they're right. We try to fit things into our understanding, into our knowledge bases, and if we can fit a structure in there, we will give it an interpretation. So saying that it's ungrammatical to me just means it's difficult to process. There are lots of examples and discussions of this in the literature. There's no knockdown argument, but I don't have to accept your theory-bound notions of grammaticality and ungrammaticality to account for facts in a much more fluid way. I think that the creativity of language, Chomsky talks about the creativity of language as being the ability to generate novel sentences, but to me, that's not where creativity lies. That's fairly simplistic stuff. Creativity lies in discourse. And recent work in the philosophy of language, which is very compatible with Peirce because it is pragmatist, is Robert Brandam's work on discursive knowledge and inferential semantics. We come to know the meaning of things as we learn to use them in discourse, and we make certain commitments to what they mean and how we will interpret them. And so it's through storytelling that we become linguistic creatures. And so the creativity of language is found in storytelling and discourses and conversation, and not in so you can walk into a new culture and you can say who tells the best stories, and everybody will have a favorite person. But you don't ask who tells the best noun phrases, because that's not a big deal. Everybody can do their noun phrases. I used to think this was an argument for universal grammar and sentences being qualitatively different than stories, and I used to use it that way. But that's really not what it says. It just says that the creative aspect of language is not in sentence structures, but in discourse structures. And so I don't really think that when we look at this, when we look at the history of language from 1957 to today, that we can point to a great deal that we're indebted to Chomsky about. We're indebted to him for social facts like the creation of new departments. We're indebted to him for putting linguistics on the map in a way that nobody had done. We're indebted to him for what initially was a much more rigorous way of thinking about language. But we don't know more about language today through generative syntax than we did in 1957. We don't know more about the mind. We just, it was a great idea. I gave a talk which didn't go over very well. Many of my talks don't go over well. And at the end of the last slide was universal grammar. It was a great idea. Well, it wasn't. I said universal grammar. It wasn't even a good idea. Why think that? And it was met with silence. You could say it's a great idea. It didn't pan out. I don't even think it was a good idea. I don't think that it's a good idea when you're confronting structures to say, oh, I know, they all come from the genes. I just don't think that's the place to begin. You might be driven there by the science, but as a place to begin, I completely agree with Putnam that it's like saying that all of 17th century knowledge is innate. We just have to work it out. I mean, Plato would have thought that. He would have been fine with that. Chomsky's even said that the notion of carburetors are innate. I have a quote on that in a paper. So Fodor thought everything was innate at one point. In one of his books, he argued that just about every concept we have is innate. And that doesn't tell me anything. That's just like reading a comic book. It doesn't mean anything to me. But you read it because these are supposedly serious proposals, and you try to figure out what would they mean and how would one argue against these things. But the world is complex, and people are more different than they are alike. And there's a new book out, for example, on hunter-gatherer languages, and one of the things that says is that hunter-gatherer languages are just like all other languages. Well, the first question is, then why would you put out a book that says hunter-gatherer languages? If they're the same as everybody else, I'll just read about French. And the other thing is that, how do you know? I mean, what a silly thing to say.
No, they've looked at all of them, Dan. They've studied all 7,000. They know.
Yeah, exactly. You've looked at every language, and there's no and you have all the cultural background, and you're looking at it as somebody who's all three: anthropologist, psychologist, linguist, and a little bit of philosopher. It just, we ask the questions we're equipped to ask, and so we're not always equipped to ask the questions that have the answers. And it's a lot of our research is, Chomsky gives this illustration of a guy who loses his keys, and he's over searching for them under the street lamp, and somebody said, "You find them?" He says, "Well," they said, "I don't know if they're here or not." He said, "Well, then why are you looking there?" "Because the light's better." Again, we're just these primitive creatures feeling our way around in the dark. That's not an excuse for not doing good science, but it's the other thing we like to do is have a high priest or high priestess. So we always look to specialists. We look for talking heads. And reporters are really bad at this. Like reporters will always go, I know because I've been covered so much in the press, whenever they're going to get another opinion about me, I know who they're going to go ask, right? The people who they always ask. And so they're always going to get the same answer. One reporter was doing a story on me for an Israeli newspaper, and I said, "Here's an idea. Why don't you be original and not ask these people, ask some other people?" And so he didn't do the story. I got to tell you, you don't make a lot of money just because you're covered in all the newspapers. And I've seen my picture enough to know that it's not something I necessarily want to have shared with thousands of people. So unless they want to put some money up front there, I'm happy to be reported on in a positive way. But when it's just repetitive and there are people saying the same thing, well, that's the way it works, because imitation and innovation are the two great forces in society. Imitation always works unless the ecology shifts drastically. Therefore, imitation is always the simplest solution. If we're living in the same environment and I know that somebody else's solution works, why would I invent my own? I just do theirs, because that takes a lot less effort. It's only when the ecology shifts dramatically that innovation comes about. So everybody imitates, and we imitate celebrities. So why do people buy the jerseys of famous athletes? Why in the world would I want to wear somebody else's name on my back? I couldn't give a rip that I had, this guy. Why would I, if I saw, I love Mick Jagger's music. I love the Rolling Stones, but I wouldn't walk across a room to greet Mick Jagger. I sure the hell wouldn't ask anybody for their autograph. This is just silly stuff. And so why do this selfie crap? And I remember walking around semester at sea when I was dean on that, traveling around the world, and all the students are taking photos everywhere and videos. And they said, "Dan, you're not videoing anything. You're not taking any photographs." I said, "Yeah, well, it's called my eyes. See, I can see it." I said, "Why would I want to take a picture? Who the hell's ever going to, you can actually sit somebody down and walk them through all 5,000 of your photos? They don't want to see that stuff. Tell them to go visit." And so much of that is so a lot of the following of Chomsky is the same thing as wearing professional athlete jerseys. We just want to be on the Chomsky team, or we want to be on the somebody else team. And I've never been a really good team player. I just find it offensive to think that anybody, I know there are a lot of people smarter than me in the world, but I like to pretend they're not, so I be responsible for finding things out on my own.
Well, like for me, learning about this this issue about the cognitive revolution and the history of modern linguistics, I think the thing that's been disturbing for me has been to think about again, how some of this stuff has reflected on the industry that I work in, which is language learning, and how a big debate that's happening right now in language learning is how for the past 50 years we have reified the native speaker, and the objective of every language learner and every language course is about trying to be like a native speaker, and it's just a stupid idea. It doesn't make sense, and it's just something that everybody believes to be true. And I came across this quote from Chomsky, and he said, linguistic theory is concerned with an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows the language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors. And it's basically a description of a unicorn. Whoever that is, it doesn't exist. And I see the same thing reflected in with the students, how they want this kind of perfect speaker. And I don't know, it just really makes me sad, actually.
Chomsky's quote makes sense in for a couple of reasons. First of all, idealizations are always important in science. When we talk about gravity, we're talking about gravity usually in a vacuum. When you say that a feather and a rock will fall to the ground in the same amount of time, that might be true in a vacuum, but it's not true in the real world. If Galileo had actually dropped two things from the top of the Tower of Pisa, they would have gotten there at different times because it's not a vacuum. So that's the good thing about it. So it's okay to say that. But the other issue that is not so okay is that it's based on the idea that there is a static knowledge of grammar, that language is something you know rather than something you do. I talk about languaging more than I do language. We're languaging all the time. It's an activity that we're engaged in, and it emerges from knowledge, but these knowledge allows freedom. We're not rules in that sense. That's one of the appeals of some forms of embodied cognition, is the idea that we're sort of resonating with the world. That's not very precise, and so I don't want to defend that idea because I'm not able to defend that idea. But there's an appeal to that of embodied cognition. But what I do think is that if that's part of the reification of Chomskyan grammar, it's not only an idealization, because idealizations are okay. It's an idealization that leaves out what's really exciting about language, which is, how does it vary? The linguist Stephen Levinson from the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, he's retired now, I guess, said that variation is where it's at. And he has a paper called The Original Sin of Cognitive Science, which is that it was after stability, like the quote you just gave me from Chomsky, as opposed to variation. And variation is where it's at. And that's what I think too. And so the big failing of cognitive science is, first of all, there isn't one. There's just a lot of studies of the brain. There's no such thing as cognitive science. When I'm trustee professor of cognitive sciences, but I made sure to put that on there as plural. And I could make up my own title. They made me a trustee professor, and then you can make up your own title. So I put cognitive sciences because that's a more grand sounding name than linguist or sociologist, which I don't want to be called by those labels. So, but sciences, not science. There is no science of the brain. There are lots of people that look at the brain and cognition from a variety of perspectives. The best that's being done, in my opinion, in the world today is at MIT's Brain and Cognitive Sciences department. Just some of the best work on language, some of the best work on the brain, some of the best work on cognition anywhere in the world, probably the best actually, is being done there. So I don't know whether they call it singular or plural in the title of the department actually, but I know that in practice it's plural.
I just want to finish by just asking you one final question. So this is actually the closing paragraph of a paper written by Jeffrey Pullen about the philosophy of linguistics. And the final paragraph is, while attention continues to be lavished on questions about how creatures like us came to have brains perfectly adapted to learning languages, few philosophers or linguists consider the possibility that the right question is how natural languages adapt themselves so well to being learned by creatures like us. Do you think that kind of sums up the situation right now?
It's an extremely good way of putting it. In his book, The Symbolic Species, Terence Deacon, also of UC Berkeley, argued for exactly that point, that language adapted to us. And he did it from the perspective of Charles Peirce's semiotics. There are mathematical aspects of semiotics, which are not that complicated. And once we have those in mind, we know that languages, symbols adapt themselves to cultures. They come out of cultures, and the grammars to support those symbols come out of cultures. So yes, I think that the right way to look at it, it's. I also asked this about the mind. Cognitive science, as generally understood, asks what is in the mind. To me, the question is not what is in the mind, but what culture is the mind in, or what is the mind in, just more generally. And that's a similar way of putting it relative to cognitive sciences. So it has, how have our minds adapted to our cultures, and how have our languages adapted to our minds and our cultures? I think that's the right way to look at it.